And Republicans are showing us today exactly what they actually care about. Today, they have had the chance to hold big corporations accountable for the damage they've done to our communities, but instead of looking into that, have invited big corporations here to air their grievances about how everyday Americans are bullying them. By holding this hearing, Republicans on this committee have shown that they care more about putting profits over people, that they care more about perpetuating a myth that people in communities around the country who have been exposed to toxic chemicals, sold contaminated baby powder, and flooded with opioids in their communities are demanding too much by demanding justice. These folks are not the villains. The American people are not the villains. They are people in our communities fighting back against wealthy corporations, and they're the real heroes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my district in Central Florida, I've met with countless families, children, and seniors whose lives have been devastated by the opioid addiction and epidemic. In 2019, a driver in a community that's in my district called Bithlo pulled into a stranger's driveway, abandoned the car, and in the car left 2 overdosed women in the back. When they found the car and they found the women, they were barely breathing. I'll say recently, thanks to the tireless work of folks like Project Opioid, Transformation Village, leaders like Tim McKinney, and other local organizations in Central Florida, things are trending in a better direction, but it's still dire. This is supposed to be the oversight committee, and so far the only oversight we've done is into the municipality of Washington, D.C., into the president, nothing coming out of that, seeing Hunter Biden's pick. I mean, this is the stuff we've been doing here. And recently, more than 100,000 people have died from opioid overdoses in 2022, and pharmaceutical companies that push prescription opioids were partly responsible. In the lawsuits that followed, Johnson & Johnson was forced to pay $5 billion in a settlement. Following that very public settlement, for some reason, Johnson & Johnson decided it would be a good idea to send their Assistant General Counsel to Congress to complain about these and other lawsuits that Johnson & Johnson have been a part of. Johnson & Johnson have a market cap of over $400 billion. The 2021 lawsuits and the countless Americans who were impacted by the opioid epidemic only set Johnson & Johnson back a cool $5 billion. Yet today, my Republican colleagues turn a blind eye to the opioid crisis. They rather use the gavel to amplify corporate demands that seek to deny Americans access to the resources needed to hold corporations and companies like Johnson & Johnson accountable. Of the $26 billion that 4 major drug companies agreed to pay for their role in the opioid epidemic, about $2 billion went towards lawyer fees. Now, in this community in my district of Bithlo, the per capita income is roughly $30,000 a year. Ms. Steinmetz, I have some pretty straightforward questions for you. If someone in Bithlo, in my district, had a family member that was mismarketed opioids and suffered life-changing addiction or even worse, death, how would they normally seek redress from the pharmaceutical companies that were partly responsible for the mismarketing?
Through lawsuits.
Through lawsuits. If they got into this lawsuit, could they represent themselves?
They would need counsel.
But they have the right to also represent themselves,
yes,
correct?
They have the right to represent themselves.
Against an army of pharmaceutical lawyers, how would that go if someone was representing themselves, if they didn't have the means necessary to accrue tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawyers' fees?
Per se litigants who represent themselves are rarely successful.
Rarely successful. Many of these lawsuits are complicated and last for years, right? I mean, you know, how do you think one of my constituents in Bithlo making 30 grand a year would be able to afford tens of thousands, $100,000 in lawyers' fees? Do you think that might be possible for them or no?
I do think that plaintiffs should be able to access financing, whether it's through the contingency fee or through third-party funding litigation. I do have a concern that sometimes these people are the ones who are preyed on the most.
And Ms. Steinmetz, last question. In civil cases, if someone who needs to file a lawsuit can't afford an attorney, is there a constitutional right that one be provided to them?
In civil cases,
In
no.
civil cases, no, there's not. And the Johnson & Johnson, I want to say loud and clear, you paid $5 billion for your role in the opioid epidemic and acknowledged no wrongdoing. Number one, there was wrongdoing. Number two, it should have been a hell of a lot easier to take Johnson & Johnson to task, and I think they should have had to pay a lot more money. Shame on Republicans for holding this hearing to vilify the people who are helping poor and working class Americans level the playing field and stand up for themselves. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.